Hello everyone, welcome to the GeoEcolologist. I'm Dr. Krishnanand, and in this session we are going to learn about structuralism. So what is this structure all about and how it is different from the concept of structuration theory? So let's understand in today's session. But before we go ahead, please like and subscribe to our channel and don't forget to press the bell icon for the updates. So now, when we have already learned about Marxism and radicalism, also let's learn about what is this structuralism. So the word itself is what? Structure. So how this structure of society, the structure of space has been built on what principles? How human beings have important role to play in the building of these structures. So let's understand this structuralism with this definition that it is basically a theoretical approach to what? To human geography. Human geography basically is what? The geography is created by human beings, so which is characterized by a belief that in order to understand the surface patterns of human behavior, it is necessary to understand what? The underlying structures. And that's important. Why? Because it produces the shape. It produces or gives shape to human actions. So those underlying features, those structures that give shape to human beings' decision making, in turn that shapes up the real space on the ground. So let's understand that thing, which is the structure. So structuralism assumes that there are social and cultural structures within society that those shape individual acting, thinking, talking, all those important things that we do as human beings. So these things are being shaped up by what? By these social and cultural structures that we are built upon. So structuralism does not focus on individual motive and interpretation of things, but on material and symbolic structures. So this is important, which function as a mold for social praxis. So what happened? The structuralism was largely talking about the process behind the human being's behavior, not just the behavior and space. So why human beings makes a certain decision and how this kind of acting, thinking, behaving, talking, where is it coming from? So those are important cultural structures and material structures that were being scrutinized and studied under this particular ideology of structuralism. So structures are a crucial part of the social world and are attributed with generative or causal power. So this was important point here, that generative or causal power. So these social cultural structures have this generative power or the causal power. So cause and effect relationship. So this cause was the structure. So this was being analyzed in the structuralism. Now, structuration theory is important to understand when we study about structuralism. And what is the difference? So let's understand. The structuration theory, whose main proponents were these two sociologists, Anthony Giddens and French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. So these two important scholars that we study in sociology have great importance in the making of this structuration theory. And how? Because it finds origin to this approach in their work, where it talks about the structure does not exist at one moment. Structure is a continuous flow of process reproduced by actions. So the structure was defined by Anthony Giddens and Pierre Bourdieu as a particular process of continuity of what? Human beings' action and reaction that is there in continuity in this space. So what happens? He prefers to talk about structuration rather than structuralism. Why? Because when we say structuration, it is continuous process. But if we talk about just structuralism, it is just talking about that ism. Only just a fixed ideology in a fixed way. So that was important to understand. Structuration theory views society not as existing independent human activity, but also not as a product of human activity. So that was important. It was talked about the actions which were reproduced from the previous actions, and it was a continuous flow that led to the particular social structure. So that was the structuration theory. Now let's look further the relationship of the structure and social practice, which is largely dual in nature, that has been said in structuralism. So meaning that social practices refer to social structures, and that social structures are related to the previously performed practices and social actions. So there is a causality involved. So where one causes the other and it keeps on going on. So another structuralist thinker, John Piaget. So John Piaget explained it in a psychological way, where ideas about structuralism were discussed through his theory of cognitive psychological development of children. So how these children develop the knowledge base, how they look at the society, the practices, how they cognize it, and these children are the same who grow up and start practicing of the same ideologies. So what happens, there is a creation, and from that creation there is another creation, there is a continuity of this process. So he said that process of gathering knowledge consists of different phases or stages, and therefore structures are also in these phases that we study, right, from childhood to the person who grows old. So in every phase there is a particular cognitive psychological development that shapes up the environment as well, the space as well, the society as well. So each stage in the development of knowledge has its own characteristics and systems, but also knowledge itself consists of structures. So this was talked about in the theory of Piaget. So he said that knowledge itself also has several layers because it is kind of an accumulation of all those perceptions into cognition. So that was important. Furthermore, we see that structuralism is an approach within geography which is characterized by the fact that the belief that to understand the surface patterns of human behavior, it is necessary to have this knowledge about these structures underlying them. If we don't understand the structures underlying them, we cannot gather the knowledge that is required. So that was important. And how are these structures being produced? These are produced by human actions. So what we have to study is human actions and the reasons behind those actions. So that is what structures talked about. So only if you have that knowledge, you will be able to influence human behavior. If you have to influence human behavior, you need to understand this particular knowledge, where this action is coming from, where this structure is leading to this action. So all those processes have to be studied. So this structuralism approach was largely in the historical geography, where structuralist perspective provided a real method to study and interpret the events of the past. So what happened and why it happened, what were the underlying structures. So largely it was of historical geography importance. So contribution of these scholars like Pred in 1979 is notable in historical geography as he used this concept of structuration in his analysis. So let's analyze past to understand the present. That is what the structuration led to. So structuralists basically talked about all those processes behind human beings' behavior that led to the particular way of spaces creation, the societal development. So that was important in structuralism. Now, the most prominent entry of structuralist approach in the geographical researches could be even traced through the works of Marxist geographers in 70s. So this was particular approach that also was mixed with Marxist approaches. So Marxist geographers also talked about this structuralist approach. So this was in the works of Richard Peet in 1977. We find that the growing interest in geographers to adopt Marxist perspective was because of the Western society's dissatisfaction to the existing structure. So that's why the Marxist approach was being followed, and that's why radicalism came to this parallel of positivism. So the work of David Harvey, that is Social Justice and City, acted as a stimuli for geographers to adopt Marxist approach for geographical research. Why? Because this approach is holistic and stressing more on interdependence of both economic and social issues in the terms of production, consumption and distribution, which were talking about the formation of these structures through ages. They talked about particular behavior of people based on this structure, which was largely talking about this dissatisfaction, this idea of being exploited, the idea of power, the idea of politics, the idea of redistribution. So this was important in the works of Marxist geographer who also followed the structuralist approach in 1970s. Then further what we see is the structuralism ultimately did not give again a satisfactory solution to find out the problems of empiricism. Rather, it took several forms of Marxism, that is to provide a structural analytics of power and social process. So what happened? The structuralist perspective was hijacked by the Marxist perspective and amalgamated, who talked about largely this analysis part of power and the social processes. So what happened? The engagement of human geographers with structuralism was short-lived and worked as a transition when geographers took over some other approaches and dealt in more depth. So what happened? postmodern writers. We are going to learn about postmodernism in the lectures to come. So these postmodern writers also went hostile to these totalizing ambitions of these conventional social sciences and humanities. So they rejected this notion that social life displays what could be called global coherence, or the structure of society regulates its everyday life in some automatic preset fashion. So they said that it's not like this preset fashion of these structures that determines the social life. It keeps on changing. The notion has to be not fixed. So these postmodern writers actually criticized and were hostile to this idea of structuralism. So what happened? There was this opposing idea of structuralism which led to development of furthermore theories which we study as post-structuralist theory under an ideology that we say is post-structuralism. So which is largely in context to questioning the structuralism. So that's why it is post-structuralism concept. So now, when we have learned about the concept of structuralism, structuration theory and its amalgamation with the Marxist concept, it's time to understand about humanistic geography and also the postmodern phase of geography. So stay tuned for the lectures to come. So all my best wishes, take care.